All right, it is 10:05. So welcome everyone to our first annual human trafficking training with Fairfax County. It is not the first human trafficking training, but it is the first that we hope to make an annual event. So my name is Abby Picard. I am the Human Trafficking and Sexual Violence Coordinator for Fairfax County. I am going to go ahead and start the recording for today's presentation now. So if you are on screen and would like to come off screen, please feel free. Um, all right, and we will be recording the entirety of this presentation. It will later be uploaded to the website, so anybody who's unable to make it today will be able to view it there. And I am going to turn it over to our panelists and pin them to the top of your screen. But we will start with Meredith McKean from Northern Virginia Family Service. I'm realizing I need to unmute you.
Thank you. I was trying. Good morning, everyone. I'm Meredith McKean. I am one of the Vice Presidents of Programs from Northern Virginia Family Service. So you'll hear a little bit more from me later about NVFS and a little bit about the intervention side. But I'll let my fellow presenters introduce themselves and we'll get started.
I can go ahead and go next. My name is Courtney Swarchek. I'm a detective here with Fairfax County Police Department. I work in our Major Crimes Bureau. I'm our senior sex crimes detective as well as the detective that handles all lead on all the human trafficking cases that occur here in Fairfax County.
And hi, my name is Alexandra Leiden. I am the Anti-Human Trafficking Senior Staff Attorney at Legal Services of Northern Virginia. I handle all of our civil cases for survivors of human trafficking throughout all of our jurisdictions in Northern Virginia. So welcome everyone to the presentation. This is Human Trafficking 101. As Abby said, my presenters and I are going to run through a training just giving you the rundown of human trafficking as well as some local statistics. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and Abby can flag them through for us as we go. But thank you for being here and thank you for your time and attention. Bear with us as we try to change the slides. That's just a disclaimer for my grant, so bear with us. All right, so as I said, today we're going to learn a little bit about the identification of human trafficking and its prevalence in Northern Virginia, as well as some harmful stereotypes and misconceptions that people have about survivors of human trafficking and traffickers. We will also learn some indicators as well as the definition of human trafficking federally and some, methods of trafficking and ways that traffickers control their victims. And we'll also learn some techniques that we can use as service providers when working with survivors of human trafficking, while always remembering to defer to the experts at all times, if you can. And then last but not least, we'll learn about some resources for human trafficking in our area that you can refer survivors to. All right, so let's talk about what is human trafficking, the definition. This is the definition from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. This is a federal law that defines human trafficking in the United States. It divides trafficking into sex trafficking and labor trafficking. The definitions for them are very similar, but you can see the slight differences when they're divided up as they are here. But both of them involve the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person. And sex trafficking also includes the patronizing or soliciting of a person. So that includes the buying of a person for a commercial sex act or for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Oftentimes they use a mixture of the three. And then the end result is either the commercial sex act, which could be a sex act for something other than money. It can be anything of value, whether that be housing, food, clothing, anything that someone needs that is of value that somebody is providing for them in exchange for a commercial sex act, and through the use of force, fraud, and coercion, would be sex trafficking. Even the purchasing of somebody can be included in that, as I said earlier. And then for labor trafficking, the end result is going to be involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or modern day slavery. And debt bondage is where a trafficker will hold a debt over the survivor's head and say, you have to pay this debt off before you are done working for me. However, that debt continues to grow, and the trafficker is continuously held in this debt bondage by their trafficker. However, there is one major exception to the rules I just explained, and that is with sex trafficking and underage individuals. If somebody is under the age of 18 and they perform any sort of commercial sex act, that includes any sort of sex act for anything of value at all, it is sex trafficking. There does not need to be force, fraud, or coercion included, just because this is due to the fact that somebody under 18 cannot consent to a commercial sex act. Thus, the force, fraud, and coercion is not required in order to prove it for trafficking purposes. All right, this is what we call the PME model. There is also one called the AMP model, AMP, and it is a nice visual model that describes human trafficking for you, for all you visual learners out there. So we have PME stands for process, means, and ends. So the process includes the recruiting, the harboring, keeping somebody by force, the transporting, moving somebody across state lines, or even just with from hotel room to hotel room or house to house, obtaining them, providing them to somebody else, soliciting them, purchasing their services, or patronizing them. And then the means is going to be the force, fraud, or coercion. And then the end is going to be the commercial sex act or the forced labor, which is, as I said earlier, one of those four options. And then at the bottom, you can see the exception. Skipping right through the means, going from process to end is a minor under 18. If they are performing a commercial sex act, it is automatically human trafficking. All right, let's talk a little bit about our Virginia specific laws. So as you know, in Virginia, we're subject to both federal laws and to Virginia laws. So we've just talked about the federal law on human trafficking, and that just defines human trafficking. There are also laws about what kind of cases that you can file, including civil cases for monetary damages, as well as what kind of damages you can recover in those cases. But now we're going to dive a little bit into the Virginia laws that we have addressing human trafficking. All right, so this is Virginia's sex trafficking statute, 18.2-355. And I'm not going to read the definition for you. You will have access to these slides later. But this is basically our version of sex trafficking, which is more along the lines of kidnapping, if you actually look at the definition. So you're taking a person or encouraging them by force, threat, persuasion, or duress for the purpose of trafficking. And as you can see in number 4, you've got the definition for minors, which actually takes into account the persuasion or encouraging of a minor to enter into a bawdy place. If you don't know already, a bawdy place is what our law calls, what we would describe as a house for sex work or prostitution. So that's what it means by bawdy place. 18.2-357.1 is our penalty statute for if you are found guilty of sex trafficking, and that includes the soliciting, recruiting, encouraging, or otherwise causing somebody to be guilty of sex trafficking, and anybody who does that with a person under the age of 18 is guilty of a class 3 felony. And if they are over the age of 18, it's a class 4 felony. All right. This, as you may know, in our laws, we've got laws that say, like, this is what the offense is. This is what, as we just saw, and then you've got the ones that say these are your what you can get from them, and then we've got the definitions. So these are the definitions for qualifying offenses for sex trafficking. I won't go through them in detail, but you can read them. All right, this one is really important. Issuance of a writ of vacatur for survivors of commercial sex. Unfortunately, this is only available for survivors of sex trafficking, not yet available for survivors of labor trafficking. However, a survivor can file a petition to the court if they have been forced to perform any criminal acts. You'll learn later in our presentation that oftentimes traffickers will force their victims to perform criminal acts on their behalf, whether that be, committing check fraud or stealing something or performing acts of prostitution, things like that, that they may have been arrested for in the past. Virginia gives us a chance to be able to wipe out that conviction so that it does not affect the survivor as they're applying for jobs and trying to generally live their life in the future. And this is a little bit more about the vacatur statutes in Virginia, about the hearings and the relief that you can get, as well as the claims of relief. If we went into detail on this, I'd have you here all day, but you can read a little bit more about them. All right, and this is our labor trafficking statute in Virginia, which is not exactly a labor trafficking statute at all, because it's not. It's just an abduction and kidnapping statute, because we in Virginia have not defined labor trafficking, and we do not have it as a crime in Virginia. So instead of charging under a labor trafficking statute that does not exist, our prosecutors and police officers are left to charge under abduction and kidnapping, which is defined here under 18.2-47. And this is the penalties for the abduction and kidnapping statute in Virginia as well. I won't go into a detail, but it's a class 6 felony. All right, so 18.2-356 is an important provision. Somebody can be charged from receiving money for procuring a person for any sort of sex acts or prostitution involved in human trafficking. So if you cause somebody to engage in human trafficking and you are receiving the money from it, what we would classically call the pimp in the situation, you can also be charged for receiving that money, as well as an additional charge based on the human trafficking. All right, and this is just a list of some other laws that are related to human trafficking in Virginia. Abduction with intent to extort money, our Virginia Minimum Wage Act, that comes into play with the labor trafficking usually, as well as with sex trafficking. The federal laws will also come into play. The Federal Labor Standards Act will apply as well. But those are just a few more, including training materials on human trafficking, which are under 22.1-16.5. And last but not least, some more laws related to human trafficking, including using vehicles to promote prostitution or unlawful sexual intercourse. So if somebody is moving a victim from place to place using a vehicle, they can be charged with using their vehicle for that purpose. As I said earlier, keeping or residing in a bawdy place or a house of prostitution, and also aiding prostitution or illicit sexual intercourse. And our victims in Virginia have rights under the Victims' Rights of Crime statute, which is listed here. This includes, the right to be involved in the judicial proceedings against the trafficker. They have rights to notice, they have rights to restitution, which is money that is paid back to them as a survivor from the trafficker that can be ordered by the court. They're supposed to be able to confer with the prosecution about the case, including discussing any plea deals or, in general, just talking about how the case is going and what the outcomes may be, and just other rights that are listed here. All right, let's go into some statistics now. I do want to remind you that these statistics are they are a little bit old. It's hard. They haven't been updated because of COVID recently, but I also want to just remind you, any statistics that we're seeing on human trafficking, I want you to take with a grain of salt, because human trafficking, as we know, is something that is rarely identified in the United States or elsewhere, both by society in general and by the survivors. A lot of survivors do not know that they are survivors of human trafficking. They may know that they are mistreated, but they do not know that they classify as a survivor of human trafficking, so they often don't identify, and these statistics will not capture those people. As you may not know, human trafficking has become the second largest type of criminal activity in the world. This is because there are many reasons, but one of them is because it's a very lucrative business for traffickers. Unlike drugs where you sell them, they're used right then and there and then they're gone. A survivor of human trafficking can be used and sold multiple times over and over and over again. So it is a very lucrative business for these traffickers. These are a few demographics about human trafficking incidents in the United States in 2012. So these are a bit old, but as you can see, we have a high representation of females who identified as being trafficked, as well as minority individuals who are identified as being trafficked. There are multiple reasons for that we will get into later in this presentation, but just as a general explanation, traffickers are looking for people who they can manipulate. And so they're looking for people with vulnerabilities or who do not have good support systems or things like that. So they're really looking for people that they can manipulate and then use those needs that they have manipulated against them. All right, these are some national demographics. These are from the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I won't go through these in detail, but as you can see, we have very high numbers of cases that are reported to the trafficking hotline, including we'll have some Virginia demographics as well. All right, so in 2020, we saw, as we're coming into COVID, we saw a lot of changes in human trafficking because people couldn't go out and, be around in society like we usually we're used to being. So we saw a few changes, and those I'll discuss here. But as you can see, these are the trends in 2020 from the hotline, including 10,583 situations of trafficking identified in the United States and 16,658 victims identified. And that does not include the ones that were not identified and who do not have access to services or anyone to help identify them. This is more for you visual learners. This is a nice pretty pie chart. And this is a pie chart that kind of breaks out the types of cases that the National Human Trafficking Hotline saw in 2020. And it kind of divides them into what type of services that these survivors were providing for the traffickers. This includes your typical ones that people think of, like escort services or illicit massage businesses and outdoor solicitation, which we see is very small on the pie chart compared to what it would have usually been. But then you see ones that you don't usually think of, like peddling and begging, or working in a restaurant or food services, or health and beauty services, things like that that we don't typically think of, including one that is very, very important in our area, which is domestic work. We see a lot of labor trafficked individuals who are working in homes of individuals here. Sometimes we have diplomats who come over from other countries who bring their what they would describe house slaves, or somebody who takes care of their home over with them, and they will, basically hide them from authorities and traffic them in the United States as well. But that's not to say it's just people who are coming from overseas who are trafficking people domestically or otherwise.
Alex, could you clarify the agricultural and animal husbandry? There's a question in the chat about, is that farm work, or what does that look like?
Sure. So we see a lot of people who are trafficked to provide agricultural services. So this includes not only working on farms, picking agriculture, picking vegetables, things like that. Not only just picking, but actually just doing the day-to-day work on farms that are not being paid what they are entitled to. But we also see people who are raising animals. This includes chickens. Think of things that we use in society in large amounts. People who are working for chicken farms, or who are working on farms that produce pigs or cows or things like that. People will traffic individuals over and force them to work on these farms with these animals, or this agriculture, and oftentimes in these situations, it's where they're holding debts over their head and forcing them to work for them until this debt is paid off, or they're making promises saying, if you just do this for this amount of time, then this will happen. And so people are often stuck in those situations, performing labor without being paid for it. And I'm seeing traveling sales crews. So this often involves people who are moved throughout the country and go door to door selling things like knives, magazine subscriptions, wrapping paper. Those are just some of the ones I can think of. Anybody who would knock on your door and maybe selling services. A lot of times those people are held in that labor by the same sort of debt bondage as I was talking about earlier, where they are forced to work until they can pay off a debt. A lot of times traffickers will bring somebody from a different country and tell them that they have to pay them back for their trip over, bringing them to the U.S., and for their housing, for their food, things like that they're providing for them. And so that's how they keep them working for them, because they say, you owe me for this. And last week you ate 2 sandwiches instead of 1. So you owe me, even more this week. And, the debt continues to grow, and it's just something that they'll never be able to pay off with the wages if they are making them. Okay, I think I got the questions. All right, here's a little bit more about some national demographics from 2020. We are seeing in labor trafficking situations, the vast majority were recruited by a potential employer, whether that be within the United States or recruiting from abroad. I see in our area a lot of people who are recruited from abroad to work for somebody, and then when they get here, they're not actually doing the job that they were promised. They're actually doing something else completely, and forced into that situation. You also see 15% were recruited by a family member or somebody that they know very closely that they would call family. And 5% were recruited into the trafficking by an intimate partner or somebody that they are married to. And also a lot of cases that I see here in the United States and in our area are people who marry into a marriage, think that they are coming to the United States to live a typical husband-wife or wife-wife or husband-husband relationship. They are that, everything seems happy and fine, and then they get here and they're actually forced to do all of the labor in the home. They're not permitted to speak with anyone. They have all of their identity documents and their money taken from them. They are required to cook, clean, do everything for not only their partners, but their partners' families, care for kids for other people, and sometimes, perform sexual services whenever they are required from their husbands, things like that we typically wouldn't think of as a human trafficking situation, but that is all forced labor without pay. And it was obtained fraudulently because they were promised that they were coming in for a typical husband-wife relationship, and then it turns into a forced labor situation. So I want to point this out because this is really important. A lot of our trafficking survivors do not have access to help or to any support systems. Family and friends in 2020 were the only access point for 40% of the identified victims. If that's just family and friends. Can you think of somebody who's moved over to the United States who has no family and friends? Who are they going to have an access point in society with? Well, it might be our healthcare providers. It may be somebody, a dentist or somebody along those lines. It may be our law enforcement officers. So this is why we want to train our community members and anybody who may come in contact with our survivors to make sure that we are recognizing that they are survivors of human trafficking and getting them the services that they need. And just quickly, as we saw in 2020, due to the pandemic, online recruitment of survivors of trafficking increased by a significant 22%. That includes a 125% increase in recruitment on Facebook and a 95% increase on Instagram. So this is why it's really important to be talking to youth about safe communications while they're on not only Facebook and Instagram, but TikTok and other sort of social media sites where they can have messages sent to them from people who are pretending to be somebody that they may not be. And this is a graph that shows us cases reported state by state. As you can see, Virginia's on the far right with cases reported, and on the far left you see California with a huge number of cases reported. But I will say California has spent a lot of money and has a lot of resources for identifying and helping survivors. So I imagine that has a little bit of something to do with why their numbers are significantly higher than other states. All right, and you can see here, these are, this is a chart based on the type of visas that survivors of human trafficking have come in on. And as you can see, a majority of our survivors have come in as undocumented, which I will say puts them at even more of a vulnerability because the trafficker can use their status as undocumented against them. And this chart you see just looks at the potential nationalities of our survivors of human trafficking that were identified. And as you can see, the highest number was from Mexico. And we have a quite high number from the US as well. These charts break up our demographics based on the types of trafficking, the venues where they are, age, citizenship, and gender. So you can check these out for yourself to see kind of where we're seeing our trafficking identified in the United States.
So I see a couple questions, but they're a little bit complicated. So I think we're going to keep moving and we'll loop back around to these questions as we go forward.
Perfect. All right, these are some more of the same types of demographics from the trafficking hotline, but they're Virginia specific. We had 119 actual cases of trafficking identified with 578 contacts calling the trafficking hotline to report trafficking. These graphs separate, just like the ones we saw a minute ago for the national statistics. These are the Virginia specific statistics and how they are divided up based on type of trafficking, the venue, for sex and labor trafficking. And here we've got gender, age, and citizenship. So if you look at this in Virginia, if you could just go back really quick, in Virginia, we have the majority of our cases are actually U.S. citizens who are recognized as survivors of human trafficking. So that's not something people usually expect. So I just want everyone to keep that in mind, that you do not have to be even moved from your hometown where you were born to be trafficked. And these break down the types of requests, how the hotline got the information, including referrals or tips from the trafficking hotline, whether that be from law enforcement or from general society. Anyone can call the hotline to report trafficking. And if you do have suspicions of trafficking, I do encourage you to do that, and we will give you the information for that later. All right, so these are the top types of trafficking we saw in 2017. I'm not going to go into detail with this just because of time, but these are the same sorts of cases that we saw in the earlier slides, but escort services and illicit massage businesses being the some of the highest places that we're seeing labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And like in Virginia, domestic work. All right, and quickly, just some stereotypes and misconceptions about survivors of human trafficking and traffickers. These stats that we are seeing, Valerie, these are from the hotline. Some of them are from organizations that work with survivors of human trafficking, but the main ones that we were looking at were from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and those are from anyone who calls in. That includes law enforcement. Everyone calls the same number, and they ask who is calling, what you work in, so they can divide up who is calling. But it's everyday citizens. It's attorneys like me, it's law enforcement like Detective Swerchak, we've got service providers like Meredith, we've got, anybody can call the hotline and report, and that's where these statistics are coming from, including survivors themselves, which can also call the hotline. Okay, and as you can see on here, these are some of the myths about human trafficking compared to the truths. Like I said earlier, survivors of human trafficking do not usually self-identify because, in our heads we have, and I partially blame the media for this, but in our heads we have the visual of somebody chained to a bed and not able to move, and they're being and that's how they're sex trafficked, and they're being moved all over the country, and things like that, like what we see in the TVs and movies, things like that. But in truth, people do not actually identify, and we can see that 50% of them had contact with a healthcare professional, and not a single one of them was identified as a survivor. And, it's everywhere. It's, people think it's not in our community, but especially here in Northern Virginia, where we are right outside of DC, which is our nation's capital. So we have people who are coming to visit, and we are also right in the middle of a high trafficking area because of all the intersections of all of the highways and things like that that intersect and run through our area. So all of these things, including sporting events, conferences, anything that gathers large crowds, we will see, usually we will see an increase in human trafficking during that time. All right, and this shows that human trafficking can, it affects not just the survivor, but everyone in society. It also doesn't only happen to children, it happens to adults. And it doesn't only happen to women. It also happens to men and non-binary individuals, especially our LGBTQ identified individuals in society. All right, let's go into some facts about human trafficking. All right, this is a list of the 25 types of human trafficking from Polaris Project. Polaris Project is a really great organization. They actually run the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So they are a really great source for knowledge on human trafficking, as well as training materials and things like that. But as you can see, we've got carnivals. Those are something that you may not have thought of. Construction sites. We've got a lot of trafficking that occurs on construction sites. And as you know, in Northern Virginia, we always have construction going on. So keep that in mind, that it's not your typical, it doesn't have to be your typical situation where it's an illicit massage business or somebody who's working in a nail salon. It could be in, any type of industry that we have here in Northern Virginia and throughout the United States. All right, let's talk about who human traffickers are. All right, basically, human traffickers can be anyone. It can be somebody that you trust. It can be a family member. It can be your best friend. It can be your schoolmate. Anyone can traffic anyone. It doesn't mean that they have to be a lifelong, somebody that you think is dishonest or somebody that you don't trust. It could be somebody that you trust very much and that you love. Where does human trafficking exist? The answer, everywhere. Unfortunately, these are some of the industries that we see, like I showed you earlier from Polaris. These are some of the industries that we see human trafficking existing, especially labor trafficking. All right, what can make somebody vulnerable to trafficking? Like I said earlier, traffickers are looking for somebody who has any sort of vulnerability that they can exploit. So oftentimes we see people with a history of physical or sexual abuse, including domestic violence in the home, a lack of community or family stability, homelessness, poverty, disconnection from the education system, truancy, things like that. And especially if somebody is running away from the home and they are a youth, they are at an extremely high risk of being trafficked, because a trafficker will use the fact that they don't have a home, food, things like that, in order to force them into labor or sex work. These are some more things that make somebody vulnerable. Young age, when we're really young, we're easily manipulated. We think everything is the biggest deal ever, and we believe what people say to us because we're naive and we haven't lived through the world that we're in to learn that not everything is as it appears. So traffickers will often go after youth because of this, because they know that they can manipulate that vulnerability. And anyone can fall prey to this, regardless of their socioeconomic status, their race, their ethnicity, anything along those lines. When we're young, we tend to all be pretty easily manipulated, regardless of our skin color or where we live. Other really significant factors include recent immigration or relocation, somebody who isn't tied into the community, does not have a lot of support systems, does not have people who are used to seeing them every day and would notice if something was off with them. traffickers are going to, seize on those vulnerabilities and try to leverage them against them and isolate them from any support systems that they may have. All right, where do traffickers recruit? They recruit everywhere. Like we saw earlier, there's been a really big spike of recruitment online since we came into COVID. But previously we saw a lot of recruitment in public places. We have had a lot of reports about a couple or a few people who are recruiting for trafficking in Tyson's Mall. We've got people who who recruit for trafficking at schools. And it's not that they're saying, hey, do you want to come work with me? I'm going to traffic you. They're saying, you are just so beautiful. I run this modeling business and I really think you would be the perfect model for us. You really have our look, things that really sweeten the person up, make them think that they're getting this really cool opportunity and this really great deal. And they promise them things in order to get them to agree. And then, once they get in the situation, they typically will they'll learn information about the survivor, they'll use that information against them, or they'll, we've seen cases where traffickers will sometimes drug or otherwise incapacitate an individual. They may sexually assault them or do something along those lines while filming it, and then they may use that against them in the future. We've seen this sometimes in gang trafficking situations as a way to blackmail individuals. And when you're young and somebody has that sort of that blackmail on you, it can seem like it's the end of the world if that gets out. So if they say, if you tell anyone, I'm going to show this video to your mom and your dad, and I know your mom's schedule is 8 to 5 and she works at this office, and I'm going to show up at the office tomorrow and I'm going to show it to her, and I'm also going to show it to your grandma, and I'm going to send it to all of your classmates because I have their email because your best friend so and so gave it to me because I've become friends with her too. Things like that they use to manipulate and threaten people into doing things that they otherwise would not want to do. And as I mentioned earlier, internet, of course, is a high recruitment place. They may pose as a teen, and recruit through the boyfriend method, where they pretend to be somebody's boyfriend and they're a love interest, and then they turn out to be not what they say they are, and may leverage the person's feelings of affection for them in order to force them to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. All right, so this is the lover boy technique that I was just talking about, where they'll present themselves as a boyfriend or a girlfriend, woo the victim with, love and what we call love bombing. A lot of you may be familiar with that term. Gifts, make them really feel just really protected and super supported and really loved. And at the same time, they may be planting little seeds of distrust to separate the survivor from their support system, including their families. They may say something along the lines of, your parents have a lot of children to take care of. You're just another mouth to feed, and you're the oldest. And, they don't really care about you, and you're really just a problem for them. And you remember when your mom said last week that you were getting on her nerves? That's, she really doesn't care about you anymore, and she really wants you to leave her, things like that to kind of separate the survivor from their support system, who may be able to recognize that something is off, or may be able to provide them with support in order to get them out of the trafficking situation. This is a little bit about how traffickers recruit and maintain their victims. Like I said earlier, they're using a variety of manipulation and control tactics, including emotional and psychological abuse and threats, economic abuse, like we were talking about, where you hold debts over the person's head, the debt bondage situation, forcing somebody to work for them in order to pay off their debts, because if you loved me, you would do this, prove that you love me, things like that, the emotional manipulation. They often make promises addressing the needs that the client has in order to kind of manipulate them and keep them needing whatever they are providing them with, in order to keep their labor. Like I said earlier, we often will see survivors that are addicted to substances that perhaps maybe weren't addicted previously, that the trafficker has gotten them addicted to, or they may have already had that problem, and that is one of the vulnerabilities that the trafficker is seeking out. And then the trafficker then becomes the person who provides them with those drugs or substances, and that is what allows the survivor to, be caught up in the web of the control and manipulation that the trafficker has set for them. This is some facts about labor trafficking specifically. We see family members forcing people into labor trafficking, including their children. In order to make money, they may take them out of school and force them to work. This happens a lot in rural areas with, the agricultural crops and things like that, or somebody who has recently moved to the United States and doesn't have a lot of support system, and maybe hasn't enrolled in school yet. So the school doesn't know that they are supposed to be in school. Things like that you may not typically think of. These are some facts about sex trafficking specifically. We see a lot of physical violence involved with sex trafficking in order to keep the survivor doing the sex work for the trafficker. A family may sell a victim to another trafficker or to a pimp in order to be trafficked, not only in the sex work realm, but also for labor purposes. We often see U.S. citizen females who are victims of remote interactive sexual acts. So that includes video cam acts and things like that we see that are growing with the high use of internet in society these days. All right, this is a video that is really helpful to, we often show it to our younger kids, but it also is just a really good explanation of human trafficking and how it can work in the lover boy technique.
So Alex, I'm actually going to pause and see if we can do some of these questions in the chat. And
Okay.
if we get some answers from Alex or from our other presenters. So the first one from Jessica says, Opportunity Neighborhoods, Herndon Community Organizer. We've been hearing stories of folks who've arrived in the country with a sponsor, quote unquote, who has promised them work and a great life. And when the folks get here, after they receive high amounts of money from their victims, the sponsor that supposedly was going to host the victims kicks them out on the street, and the immigrants are left on the street with no one to go to and no shelter. Have you heard anything about these situations going on?
Yes, that happens unfortunately all the time. We see that on a regular basis. And it's not only that they're just kicking them out. Sometimes they're forcing them to work, like maybe the sponsor owns a business and they're forcing them to work in that business and taking all the money from them there. This happens especially a lot if the person is underage and a youth, because they really have nowhere to go and they don't have the skills in order to be able to get themselves out of that situation, especially when they're in a new country where they don't know the language, where they don't know the laws, where they don't know the way the legal system works, or our systems for accessing services. We often take for granted the fact that people, when they come here, just don't know how our society works and how our services work. And, as an attorney in the legal system, I sometimes get frustrated and overwhelmed with how the legal system works. And I find it hard to navigate. And I'm somebody who's highly trained in it. And I try to think, what if I had no knowledge in this and I don't speak the language? What would I do in this situation? And we really have to put our empathy hats on and think of, what are people going through and how can we make this situation better for them in providing our services to the community?
Thank you, Alex. Does anybody else want to add to that question before I go to the next one?
Meredith, she can't unmute.
There we go. I don't know what's happening. It could be user error. Yeah, just to add, and we're going to talk a little bit more in a later section, sort of like what to do and where to refer and how to get help and resources. But that particular instance is a really good example of where somebody who has experienced trafficking or is highly likely to have experienced trafficking in the case that you described, and you know that they have an immigration issue and a sort of unknown status, it's really important to connect them to an immigration attorney for all of those reasons. And we're really lucky in Northern Virginia that all of our immigration attorney providers and nonprofits also link and connect to the whole sort of wealth of other social services. So I think, and you'll hear me say it again later, but it's a perfect example of why really meeting people where they are and whatever sort of need is apparent, whether or not they would call it trafficking, or even if you're not 100% sure, connecting people to at least sort of one basic and sort of evident need is a really great way to get people services.
Thank you both. Next question is, are people coming into the country undocumented, or are they coming out of status as overstays who came into the country legally?
Both. I see people who come in on a visitor visa or on a work visa who are then forced to overstay by their trafficker, or they don't know the laws. They were kept ignorant about the laws of their visa and their requirements, and so they overstay accidentally. Obviously, the trafficker knows that they're overstaying, and then they later use that against them, potentially. We also see people who have come in, we've got, people who are coming in illegally who are sometimes somebody pays to have a coyote smuggle them in, things like that are happening. So we see a variety of these situations, and it could be either or a combination.
All right, I'm going to do one more question and then we'll watch the video. The question is about addressing some of the social media trends on Facebook of kidnappers in stores, parentheses, following women to their cars, marking cars, etc., being kidnapped at Target. This person says they get a lot of community members who ask them about these situations. So I'm assuming that means in their work. So can you talk a little bit about those and if that's something that you see?
So I don't see a lot of kidnapping situations. I think that's pretty uncommon. I think that's one of the, the ideas that we have of people, out here just coming at you and kidnapping people when they least expect it. And I think it's kind of a fear tactic that people use, especially in the human trafficking realm, in order to get attention for the topic. But it's usually somebody that you trust or somebody that you know or somebody that you think you trust or know that we see. But Courtney, I'll defer to you if you've seen any, kidnapping situations in Fairfax County. She may need help unmuting.
Sorry, I have a setting on.
Thank you,
There's
Abby.
so many folks.
No, perfect. No, and I was gonna, I agree with Alex that we don't typically see a lot of kidnapping cases, especially the ones that you're talking about where, of course, on social media and the news, things like that, we hear about the marking of the cars, the following of women, parking next to you, things like that. And that's not to say it's not happening. It very well could be, but it could also be, marking cars. It could be for some other criminal offense that, these offenders are also doing. But obviously we're starting to get more aware of human trafficking and that these things do exist in our community. So everybody's a little heightened in their awareness. And so could those things be happening? Very well could be. Are they being reported as such? No. Like Alex said, we're just not typically seeing a lot of that, kind of taken scenario where people are being abducted, people are being held hostage, held captive in that way. A lot of it is, known situations, known offenders that these people are getting into, the survivors are getting into, communication and situations with. And that's how a lot of the cases that we're seeing are, beginning and progressing from there.
Yeah, and I would just add and sort of highlight, we all sort of said it, but it is one of the really common elements is this exploitation of vulnerabilities. And that comes from sort of getting to know somebody. So a lot of what we're seeing, even if folks might be strangers at first, there's a grooming aspect to it. There is a really, in a lot of cases, sort of establishing a relationship under false pretenses, which is it's different than a sort of complete abduction. But I think the important piece to remember is once that sort of grooming and trafficking is taking place, the threats, the fear, all of that does keep somebody, whether it's physically, but often it's more mentally kind of feeling captured, feeling like they can't escape. But yeah, so we'll talk a little more because just keep that idea in mind of this exploitation of vulnerabilities, because that's also one of the ways that we really intervene is can we figure out ways to address some of those vulnerabilities in a way that is helpful, positive, and safe, and that kind of helps release the hold of the trafficker.
And I see the last comment there too, about the local targets and recruitment and kind of befriending that person and building that relationship. And that just is exactly on point for just kind of preying on those vulnerabilities of people that, we're seeing in the community, and the traffickers know that. And, building that relationship and that connection with the person, and then progressing it from there as they get closer, as they get more trusting of that situation that they're building in.
Yeah. And especially with the point on the young mother too, like we love our children. Those are our biggest vulnerabilities. If somebody makes a threat against your child, you are going to do whatever you can to save your child, presumably. So, traffickers can use that and make threats against, children or family members that the survivor really cares about in order to continue to control them and force them into, whatever they are requiring them to do.
Thank
And
you
Abby,
all. I'm gonna cut us off so we can keep moving. What were you gonna say, Alex?
yeah, I was just gonna say, I think we should skip over the video for now, and everyone, we can put the link in the chat for the video, because I think I'd prefer to just move along. It is a very cute
Okay.
video, so I do encourage everyone to watch it.
Yeah, we can share it out after, but I'm glad that we took some time for the conversation, and we'll keep moving.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to the lovely Detective Swerchek.
Thank you, Alex, so much. So the next part that we're going to kind of just kind of do a brief overview. Obviously, being in law enforcement and touching a lot of the cases that happen in Fairfax County, there's a plethora of information and a plethora of, kind of those what if, situations and scenarios, and, obviously the things that we see in the news, the things that we see in social media. But I just kind of want to touch on it a little bit about what we are seeing here in Fairfax County, what my role is, how I get involved, and how I kind of use all the other resources that we do have in support of our survivors of human trafficking. And so next slide, just a little bit on the sex trafficking. So obviously for us here at the police department, same thing, the victims, and with that being over the age of 18, because as Alex already went over, under the age of 18, it's a little bit different, are being sex trafficked are often being trapped in the situation through force, fraud, or coercion. It could be one, it could be all three. It could be a mixture of them. It could change at different times, through that experience. But the biggest thing is that it's not voluntary, even though it could appear to be. And that's why it's, important for us to do our jobs and take our roles and kind of dig a little bit deeper into these situations that the survivors are in. And even though at face value something might appear to be voluntary, the survivor might even be saying that it is on their part, but for us to pick up on those additional cues, the information that we're being given, and kind of that sixth sense that we get, just to recognize that in fact it may not be a voluntary situation that they're in, or they may not know any better if that's the life that they are used to. Those three, elements, the force, fraud, or coercion, again, those are not necessary for minors under the age of 18. That age is to cut off any juvenile. They just simply cannot be, in that sex trade for any reason whatsoever. I know a lot of the questions sometimes come with, the trade of money, the goods, things like that. Just because someone is maybe being paid for sex or are in, that business, even if they're getting to keep a portion of that money, that portion of those funds does not mean that they're not being trafficked. That doesn't mean that it's a voluntary situation that they're being placed into. They very well could be allowed to keep some of that money that they're getting, a portion of their proceeds from, the acts that they're doing. They don't have to always give all of the money to the trafficker or the pimp for it to be considered trafficking. A lot of the time they are allowed to keep a portion of that, whether it be for, maybe to pay for their own bills, their rent, their food. Sometimes they can keep that portion. So again, it's not necessary for all of the money, all of those, all of that things that they're getting to be given back to the pimp or the trafficker for them to qualify for that, for us to see that as a trafficking situation. And a lot of the time too, traffickers are tending to be the person that's going to be providing things like the apartment, a hotel room, food, rides, anything like that, where the commercial sex acts are being perpetrated. So it could sometimes be viewed as, a caretaker or maybe that consensual relationship that the trafficker is putting, the survivor in. However, again, it's up to us to kind of dig a little bit deeper and recognize that that might not be the voluntary situation that this person is actually in, that they are being forced or forced to do, these types of acts. And the next one, I know, again, Alex went over that a little bit in the beginning, that labor trafficking is definitely not something that we're coming into contact with often, but that doesn't mean that it's not happening. It's just very hard to identify, especially because, as you saw in Virginia, we don't have specific codes, titled for labor trafficking. A lot of it is just those abduction charges, the kidnapping. But that doesn't mean that we have to just stop it at that charge, that, we should be looking a little bit further, digging a little bit deeper to recognize these labor trafficking trends, especially to help us, kind of assist and build on this so that maybe we can make it much more recognizable, for us and for our community members as well. So it is very hard to identify because the victims often don't have any contact with society outside of the job that they're in or the home that they're staying with. They oftentimes don't speak English as their first language, and they have that no support system from friends, family, whether in Virginia or even in the United States if they came over here on some sort of visa or other terms. A lot of the time they come over here for, that job that they think that they're getting into, that they're going to be taken care of, being able to provide for themselves, provide for their families. But then when they get here, that in fact is not the case. And then they're very segregated from the outside world. They don't know, the help that we can offer them, the help that they're, afforded here as well too. And they have no way to reach out in terms of finding that help either. And so again, because they're so often cut off from the outside world, it's very hard for us to recognize and to have these things, be reported. They're oftentimes forced to work in a typical business. It could be massage parlors, nail salons, any of those other places that we kind of showed you on those, trafficking trends or where trafficking is occurring, or it could even be within families' private homes. We saw the au pairs that, are also coming over, things like that, situations. Again, any sort of employment where they're not getting the terms that they agreed to or that they thought they were going to, or that they should be, that, they're afforded. It can also appear, in that context of the forced or arranged marriage that Alex went over a little bit too, that they're coming over here thinking that they're going to be in some sort of relationship with this person. It could be romantic, it could be that marriage, it could be, any other arrangement that had occurred. But then when they get here, again, they're being forced to work for the home, take care of the children, do all the cooking and cleaning. And it's not that arrangement that they initially thought they were getting into or that they thought they were going to be a part of. And again, we have to take those cultural differences into consideration as well too, that sometimes people don't know any better. Again, they don't know how, things are supposed to be happening here. If they come over here and they don't have an idea about that, that they, again, don't know the help that they can get. They don't know our law. They don't know our legal system, and that these things are not right, that they shouldn't be, in these situations, and that we can help them get out of it. And then in just a little bit to, overlap both the sex and labor trafficking, A lot of the times we're seeing the identity documents, that's a huge thing, are frequently taken from these survivors. Whether it be their passports, their identifying documents, anything like that, they're taken from, these survivors, they're held onto by that trafficker. So this person feels like they cannot leave. That a lot of the time is their lifeline. Those documents that prove who they are, where they came from. With those being held, they don't feel that they can leave because they don't have the ability to then go off and get, services or help or assistance or build a new life outside of the one that they're in. We talked about a little bit too as well that, people are a reusable product, unlike drugs. So it's a very lucrative business that it's not, like a drug. It's not something that's used and it's gone and we have to try to get more. A person obviously, unfortunately, can be continuously used in these situations. Especially, we do see a lot of time in gangs that these people are just being used or being trafficked, passed from one situation onto a next to another person. A lot of the cases that we do have kind of stem from some prostitution question on whether, this would fall into a prostitution realm or if it will fall into a sex trafficking realm. And so it's very important, again, that we're kind of digging a little bit deeper into these questions and making sure we're asking the relevant questions to determine if this is a voluntary situation that they have gotten themselves into, or if it's something that they are being trafficked, if they're being sex trafficked and labor trafficked, and how we can support them to get them out of the lifestyle. Because again, a lot of the time, this is the only lifestyle that they know. They don't know how to get help. They don't know how to get out. And so we oftentimes too are kind of advocating and make sure that we're promoting that we're not charging these victims with prostitution. Because again, in the future, this really helps them build that new lifestyle, trying to get a job, trying to raise their kids, trying to get housing, things like that if they have that criminal history, because we charge them. So, obviously there's things that we're able to assist them with kind of rectifying that if it has happened, but also avoiding that just in the first place and making sure that we're recognizing voluntary situations from situations where people really do need our assistance. And so, we kind of went over it again too, that a lot of the times these situations often overlap with other criminal offenses as well. So they can come into, my realm in a lot of different ways. I get, all of the hotline tips that come in. We also get reports from our community members, as well as just other law enforcement agencies, whether it's local or federal. Because I'm the lead human trafficking detective for Fairfax County, all of those things come in to me as, reporting. And so if you have these questions or concerns, it's always important go ahead and make those tips. Feel free to call, the non-emergency police line to make that initial report, because it's so important that we can start, kind of into that investigation and start offering the assistance. We've spoken about how a lot of the time survivors may not be ready to disclose the information, or they might not know it or identify as a survivor yet or a victim yet. But as soon as we can get into contact with them and start building that confidence, and we can start building that investigation and really offering the assistance, it's so important that we're able to do that. And then in their own time, and as soon as we can kind of start building that up, we're able to help them, assist them, and then figure out how this happened and how we can rectify, the situation that we've gotten into.
All right. Thank you, Detective Swarchek. That was awesome. And really good to learn about what the Fairfax Police Department is seeing in our area. And now we will move on to some human trafficking scenarios. All right, these are some examples of labor trafficking. First, we've got Tara. She's 19. She freed herself by running away after she was forced to work with no pay selling magazine subscriptions. When she did ask her traffickers to leave, they smashed her cell phone and threatened her. She ran away to a local police station. This one you see we've got her forced labor with the selling magazine subscriptions. You see her threats and violence against her by threatening her and smashing her cell phone. And then you see that they have provided her and they have obtained her for her work. So she qualifies as a survivor of labor trafficking. Next, we have Arnold. He is 32. He's from the Philippines, and he was promised a good job in the United States by a recruitment agency. He secured a lawful visa to come to the United States, but he went into about $5,000 of debt in order to pay the placement fee to be brought over here and to get the job. He and the other workers that were recruited by the agency told them that they would be arrested by the police and deported if they left the work situation. When one worker ran away, the employer posted a wanted sign in the house that the workers lived at, saying that the runaway was wanted by the police. Here you've got the recruitment and the harboring and of Arnold and his co-workers, and you've got the transportation from the Philippines also. You've got the taking of the money from him too, so that's just another added charge. But then you've got the forced labor, and the way that they kept them in forced labor was through threats, including the threat of the wanted sign. So, that obviously is not a true wanted sign, but they put that up in order to threaten everyone else. If you run away, you're going to be arrested, just like we told you. Look, there's a wanted sign here that proves that. And last but not least, we have Maya. They are 15. They were kidnapped by two men that kept her in a locked box. They sexually assaulted her and physically harmed her. When she was not forced inside of the locked box, they forced her to cultivate marijuana without giving her any money. This also is labor trafficking. You've got somebody who is harbored. She's not permitted to leave. You've also got the extra crimes of the sexual assault and physical harm, but those are also being used as the force and the threat against her. As well as locking her in a box. That's also obviously force. And then you've got the labor of cultivating the marijuana without pay. All right, let's talk about some sex trafficking examples. You've got Angela, she's 15. She started running away at the age of 13 because of sexual abuse at home. She had contact with the child dependency system at least 11 separate times, but at the age of 13, she was introduced by one of her classmates and a friend to a man who forced her to engage in commercial sex through the threats of beatings and other abuse. She was arrested 2 separate times and charged with prostitution, but she's currently disappeared from the system. Here we've got somebody, she's 15, so we don't even need any force, fraud, or coercion for this to be, as long as she's committing a commercial sex act, he's forcing her to do it in order to get something of value. And so we have sex trafficking in this situation. Next, we have Jasmine. Jasmine is 21 and is from Korea. They were promised a good job as a masseuse, but when they came to the U.S., she already owed $20,000 to the trafficker who brought her over for bringing her over and her travel fees, or so she was told. The trafficker then told her she had to pay off all of those fees by working in commercial sex instead of a massage parlor. Jasmine was then forced to see up to 20 customers per day, and she knew that her trafficker had ties to connections in criminal gangs. They made that clear to her. Here we've got trafficking, sex trafficking, because we've got the fraud. She was promised a job as a masseuse, but when she got here and she was actually working in the sex industry, they forced her to see people. So you've got force. The threat here too is that they made it known that they were connected to criminal gangs, which is in and of itself a threat to her, that if she tries to disobey them or escape, she will be harmed. And last but not least, we have Johnny. Johnny's 14. He knew he was gay at an early age. After suffering from constant bullying at school and the pressure to conform at home, he couldn't take it anymore and he ran away. Unfortunately, he was raped on the street, and pretty soon he was selling his body in order to make money to provide for his basic living expenses. Here, we've got Johnny. He's underage and he is providing his body in order to make money, and just to meet his basic needs. So he is being trafficked. Here we don't have your typical situation where there is a pimp or somebody who is forcing him. The actual trafficker here is the buyer. The buyer who bought the services from Johnny is our trafficker in this situation. All right, interaction time. This is where you get to, well, actually you can't unmute yourself. So you're gonna have to put it in the chat. So I'm gonna ask you a few questions as we go through this. When we're going through the scenarios, I want you to kind of keep in mind the PME model that we looked at earlier. And you've got a little rundown of it right here, the process, means, and ends. So keep those in mind while we're thinking through these scenarios. All right. Scenario 1, Anissa got married to her husband in an arranged marriage in Pakistan, which was where she was born and raised. Her husband promised her that he would take care of her and provide for her, that they'd live happily ever after, and they moved to the U.S. where she'd be, free and able to live her life as a married woman. She agreed, and she was really excited about the big move. They get married, they move over here. But once she arrives here, her husband actually forces her to work in the family 7-Eleven that they own 7 days per week, all day long. And she never received a paycheck. All of the pay would go directly to her husband, who set up a bank account in her name, but did not give her access to it. And, when the pay would come in, he would remove it and put it in his account. So she had no access to her money. She was forced to cook and clean in addition to working at 7-Eleven. She was forced to cook and clean in the family home, not only for her husband, but for the whole family, including his parents. And when Anissa told her husband she wasn't happy, and this is not the life that she wanted, this is not the work that she wanted, she doesn't want to work in the 7-Eleven anymore. He tells her, well, if you don't do so, I'm going to divorce you. I'm going to kick you out of the family home. I'm going to leave you on the streets, and then I'm going to have you deported by immigration authorities because you're not even legal here in the United States. So let's think through this scenario. Flip to the next slide and look at the PME model, just as a refresher. So here, what do we think our process is that we have in this scenario? If you can put it in the chat. Anyone? So remember, she got married. Yeah, we've got providing. That's true. They are providing her services, working at the both working at the 7-Eleven, but also providing her services in the home for the mom and dad. We've got transportation, absolutely, transporting her from Pakistan to the United States. We've got harboring. He forced her to stay in that marriage and to keep working with threats to deport her, threats to divorce her, take her child away, things like that. So yeah, and we've got obtaining. He obtained her and then controlled her once he fraudulently obtained her by telling her she was going to have a happy marriage. So great job, guys. Yeah, and then now let's figure out what our means is. What do we think our means would be here? Yes, I'm seeing a lot of it. Yes, we have fraud. He's promising her fraudulently that she's moving over to be in a happy marriage and to, live her life like normal. We've also got coercion. He's coercing her into staying in that situation through his threats to her. And that can also count as force too, because he's forcing her to stay in that situation by threatening her. And last but not least, what is our end here? Involuntary servitude. Perfect. Great job, guys. You guys are experts already. We don't even need this training. All right, and this is just showing you, I've highlighted the processes in yellow, the means is in blue, and then the pink is the ends is in green. I mean pink. And I apologize if anyone is colorblind. If you are, let us know and we can provide that to you elsewise. All right, let's do one more scenario. Sam is a 16-year-old junior in high school. Sam decided to move out of their house after a fight with their parents. When they move out, they call a friend looking for a place to stay, but they're not really having any luck. They're calling friend to friend until Sam finally gets in touch with their 21-year-old friend or acquaintance, Tracy. Tracy says, sure, yeah, come stay at my mom's house. I'll send one of my friends to come pick you up and you can come stay with us. Sam's really, Sam is relieved, but then confused when a car pulls up and there's three men in the car to pick her up, and it's not Tracy. But Sam is acquaintances with Tracy. They know Tracy, so they think, oh well, they must be friends of Tracy's. I'll get in the car with them. But instead of taking Sam to Tracy's mom's house, they actually take her to a local motel where they dress her in skimpy clothing, and they take pictures of Sam in those clothing, and then later post those on a website. Despite not wanting to do this, have her picture taken, do any of this, Sam is in a really desperate situation, and unfortunately has been addicted to drugs in the past. So in exchange for a place to stay and for drugs, Sam begins to work as a prostitute for Tracy's quote unquote friends. Sam has actually exchanged sex for drugs in the past. So this is something that she's had experience with, and the men that picked her up actually take all of the money that Sam makes through her encounters with people who are buying her services. Sam realizes, they're not in a safe situation. And after about 2 days, the men leave the hotel room. And when they do, she, realizes this is my chance, and she sneaks out, escapes, and reports the abuse to the police. All right, so let's flip the slide and look at our PME model. Okay, in this scenario, what do we think our process is here? Yes, we've got recruiting. So in this situation, it's a little bit different. The recruiting is what Sam thought they were going to do was to be, just to go to stay, but they were actually brought into a sex trafficking situation through fraud. You've also got the transportation of Sam from her home to the motel. You've got the harboring of Sam there. You've got the soliciting of the buyers who are coming in to buy Sam's services. So yeah, you guys have got it all. Good job. And then, of course, you've got the obtaining too, where they've obtained Sam in order to provide her services to others. All right, let's go to the means. What do we think the means is in this situation? Yes, I see Evelyn with a fraud. Absolutely. Moshkan, yes, we've got fraud all over the place because Sam had no idea that Sam was going to be participating in commercial sex acts. She thought that she was just going to stay with Tracy. We also have force here. They are forcing her to stay in the room because they are physically keeping her in that room. And they are also, I haven't seen it yet, but we get an Erin with an all. Yes, Erin. We also have coercion because they're coercing her to stay there with drugs. And then what is our end here? It was pretty obvious, but anyone? Commercial sex act, absolutely. She is performing sexual services for money. And I do want to point out in this scenario, just because Sam has exchanged sex for money in the past does not mean that they have agreed to do it this time. Regardless of what has happened in the past, just because they have done it before voluntarily does not mean that this situation right here and now is voluntary. So it's really important to keep a clear mind and not bring any sort of biases that you may have about the survivor's past into your analysis. All right, and this just is the highlighting of our scenario. Okay, and just really quickly, this time Sam is an 18-year-old in high school. All of the same facts and everything, but because Sam is previously Sam was underage, so we did not need any sort of force, fraud, coercion, anything along those lines. But now that Sam is this 18-year-old senior, we do need force, fraud, and coercion. So keep in mind the age of the survivor when it comes to sex trafficking. Unfortunately, there's not a carve out with labor trafficking, but such is life. So as I said earlier, the age will change your analysis based on whether or not force, fraud, or coercion is required under the law. And we'll just skip through this slide. All right, and now I turn it over to my lovely colleague, Meredith McKean.
All right, thank you. And I unmuted myself seamlessly. Okay, everybody, we're sort of in the section of the presentation, which is now that we've heard a lot of information, and sometimes we know, even though we do this, it can feel overwhelming because really the scope of the issue is large. And we really do want everybody in the community to be involved in really trying to help people who are in very, very challenging situations. So this part is really kind of the like, what do I do? What can I do? How to help somebody. The other thing that we recognize, and we're thrilled to have such a large participant group, is that we know that we have folks on the call who are interacting with trafficking survivors in a professional capacity. So through service provision, whether you're working for schools, nonprofits, county agencies, so direct service, human services. Again, you may know that you are working with trafficking survivors, or as we've really learned today, all of us who provide human services are actually serving trafficking survivors, whether we know that or not. So part of it we'll be talking about how do we within our systems and organizations be able to support survivors to address their incredibly complex needs. But there are also, and the information is also helpful for folks who are concerned community members or who may be interacting with or aware of or concerned about trafficking survivors as a neighbor, as a coach, as a mentor, as a community member. So there's a little bit of both information. Some of the information is a little bit specific to service provision, but the concepts are actually transferable. So this is really hopefully helpful for everybody. And we're going to provide a list of sort of concrete resources if it really feels like, where do I go and where do I start? The trafficking hotline is a great resource. And as Courtney mentioned, our non-emergency law enforcement number. So we'll go through some specific needs, a whole bunch of resources, and hopefully at the end, folks feel at least equipped to potentially support trafficking survivors, but also will know where to go if you have questions. So, all right. Next one. And I think that's the other overall piece that you will take away from this. It is okay to not know. You can go to the next one. It's fine. Not know what to do in every situation, but you have folks in your network that you can collaborate with. So you've heard a couple different ways that we have talked a lot about. One of the biggest challenges in providing services to trafficking survivors is the lack of identification. The individuals who either are experiencing or have experienced human trafficking most likely don't know that it's trafficking. Very few trafficking survivors know what the statutes and laws are. And as you read, they are constantly changing and a little bit confusing. So a lot of times people do not know that there's a commercial exchange of money. So for example, young people who are being exploited by a gang controlled trafficking, they may know that they are experiencing sexual assault, that they are being asked to provide favors and services for gang members, for boyfriends. They may not know that there is money being exchanged. So they really, separate from not knowing what the definition of trafficking is, they really don't know the extent of the exploitation. So part of what we want to talk about today is how can we address people's needs, whether or not we're fully able to sort of prove that there's trafficking happening, but also when there are concerns and signs and some pretty clear sort of red flags, we do want to be able to get people to supports and services that can help identify the extent of the trafficking, but also not just the trafficking, what are all of the needs that result from that? Because that is the other piece that we want people to really understand. The experience of being trafficked has profound impacts on people's bodies, minds, spirit. So there are a lot of needs that stem from that. So we talked a little bit about why there's a lack of identification. So as we said, sometimes people don't know that it's happening, but also it may be a little bit too scary to seek help. So they may know that something is not right. They may know that they're being exploited, but it is because of the fear, because of the threats, because of the intimidation. It's very, very difficult for folks to directly seek help for trafficking, but you will find that people will seek help for other things. So we're going to talk about that. But what it also means is that there's a lot of sort of misidentification, what we call masking charges, for example. So you will see behaviors that seem problematic. So running away, truancy, all sorts of substance use, substance abuse. Those are symptoms, or those are ways that people either are coping with the impacts of being trafficked or are trying to keep themselves or their loved ones safe. So often, folks who are being trafficked will show up in other service systems seeking a wider range of services. Go ahead. So we want everybody to kind of be prepared. Next one. Okay, so talked a little bit about this, but really why, not just why someone may not identify as themselves as a trafficking survivor, but why, even if they know that, or once it's sort of explained to them, why they may not appear to want help or may choose in that moment not to seek the assistance. It's because they are very focused on their safety. And they have been groomed and taught and frankly shown through experience, because as you heard from all of the examples, traffickers very effectively isolate their victims. And they also make it clear to their victims, if their victims tell anybody, seek services or seek help, that is going to cause incredible harm, either to themselves, or in a lot of cases, we have people trying to keep their family members safe. So somebody has been threatened. So in addition, if there's any sort of experience previously with law enforcement that causes them to distrust law enforcement, or if they have sort of an immigration-related fear of social services, there are a lot of reasons why people do not feel comfortable seeking services of any kind, but in particular around trafficking. So why it's really important, as we'll talk about, because sometimes it is easier for survivors to seek a specific service for healthcare, for housing, for something completely, at least in their mind, unrelated to the trafficking, but that actually addresses some of their complex needs. So we want to really be prepared, knowing that folks are going to seek services for more concrete things. And we want to be able to assess further. So next one. So this is just a little bit of a sort of a different look at some of the statistics that we saw earlier. So this comes from the National Trafficking Hotline and just part of the assessment. And looks like 2020. But of the cases that were reported, you can see the different ways that people access help. So this is, again, it's a small subset of individuals who were identified as survivors. So we know that that's not everybody, but the things that led people to help most often was interaction with family and friends. That was their access to this information. It was less actually professionals in service. So we want to kind of change that dynamic a little bit, but make sure that everybody has the info they need to connect people. Next one. So this is just a visual. If anybody is familiar with the power and control wheels in terms of intimate partner violence, abuse and neglect, the same dynamics happen in trafficking. So this is another way to explain why survivors are so isolated, so fearful, and really so challenged in seeking support and services. Next one. And remember, you will receive all of these slides, so you will also have time to read more and see more in detail. So we want to talk a little bit about signs. You can go to the next one. What might be some indicators? Because as we said, it's very rare. I don't know that I can think of in my experience providing services that someone has specifically said, I am coming to you for services because of trafficking. So what it means is that there are potentially sort of either behavioral indicators, situational indicators, things that we want to stay aware of. So if you are working with somebody, and remember, these are possible signs. So if you notice this in somebody that you're working with, it doesn't mean that they are being trafficked, but the more signs you see, much more likely. So this is, if you start to notice these things, then it is looking at what other resources and supports does somebody need. But if someone is not free to come and go, clearly if they're under 18 and providing commercial sex acts, some of these are fairly obvious, but some of them are things that would take time to figure out. And we're going to talk about how, if it's appropriate, you could ask questions to get a little bit more information. Go ahead to the next one. And I'm going to encourage everybody, when you have time, to look through some of these, because there is a lot of great sort of specific information. So I mentioned that earlier, what a sort of behavioral or maybe mental health manifestation is, because remember, the experience of trafficking involves a loss of control, a loss of freedom. It's incredibly fearful. I mean, imagine being afraid basically 24/7. Either afraid for yourself or afraid for family members or loved ones. So that takes a toll. That creates both physical and mental health symptoms. And that is often what we will see if we are in a role and we are working with people. So you may see substance abuse, right? Because uses of substances are great, it's not the right word, but ways for people to address their symptoms, to manage their anxiety, manage their depression. You may see anxiety, depression, extremely nervous, extremely withdrawn, distracted, very anxious behavior around the subject of law enforcement or immigration, because again, they have been groomed not to report, right? Not to tell anybody what is happening. So anything that feels like it might be sort of an invasion of that privacy or asking questions can feel like a threat, even though when we are trying to help people, we have really good intentions about trying to get more info. That in and of itself can feel threatening. So you may see that, but also malnourishment, poor hygiene. Think about if somebody is being forced to work hours and hours and hours, and also is not free to come and go, they're not likely eating well, right? They're not likely taking care of even some of their basic needs. So you will see physical signs also. Next one. This is another one that is sort of, we call it sort of lack of situational control, right? Because somebody who is being trafficked, as we said, they are not in control of their own experience or life. So they may not have their own personal possessions, or might have very, very few, or might periodically show up with really nice cell phone, really new shoes, but no source of income. Are they frequently monitored? Is somebody else controlling their documents or their money? Are they not allowed to speak for themselves? This happens in a lot of interviews. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Somebody may be there and insist on being there in order to interpret or translate or just be helpful. That is potentially a sign. Okay, next one. These are just other sort of things that might show up as, again, as you're sort of going through a normal interaction with somebody who's participating in one of your services and one of your programs, or someone that you're interacting with. If you hear things like this, or they're showing, or in the case of juveniles, many more masking charges, so curfew violations, truancy, other sort of status offenses, doesn't seem to have a really clear whole sort of concept or story about why they're there, what they're doing, things that sort of just don't make sense or seem really, really scripted, that can be a sign also. Next one. So there are 3 slides here that have different sets of questions. This is the first one, and we'll go through all of them. But again, I encourage everybody to look at them and to choose 1 or 2 that make sense within the scope of either your job, your responsibilities, or sort of your personal style. So what we are saying is not that you need to ask every potential trafficking survivor each and every one of these questions. That is not really anybody's job, potentially law enforcement, depending on if there's an actual interview happening. But those of us that are trying to support people separate from an investigation is around finding out, 1, are they being trafficked, and do they have needs related to that? But what we also need to keep in mind, you'll hear me say it over and over, it is important to identify if there is a risk for trafficking, but people will have needs whether or not they are able to identify it as trafficking, or whether or not we are able to sort of, I used the word before, prove it. So we want to understand what the needs are, even if we're not able to sort of quote unquote make the case for trafficking or get somebody to admit that they're trafficked. That doesn't need to be the goal. So the goal in asking questions is really just to connect people to resources that they need. That's the ultimate goal, but it might be initially just to help them feel comfortable talking to you. Help them know that you're aware of this as a problem, and that if they choose to seek help in the future, they may actually be able to provide or to get more supports. Sorry, I'm reading the...
Yeah, there's just a quick question.
Yes.
Have there ever actually been documented instances of a trafficked person being branded with a barcode tattoo?
Yes, several different kinds of tattoos and all kinds of brands. Okay, so I just want to kind of go back to that first one, sorry. And you'll see the first one is general. The second set of questions is around labor trafficking. The last one, sorry, can you go back to the first one? Yes, there you go. So again, this is if in your role, it makes sense to ask people questions as part of your assessment. You can include things that would also generate information about sort of what their living situation is. Or these are things that you could decide to add to or follow up on after some sort of general assessment or intake. But questions around their medical care, being denied food or water, do you have a safe place to sleep? Do you have family nearby? Things that are fairly not intrusive, but the more information you get, you can get a little bit more specific. So these are general human trafficking. You can go to the next slide. I'm just being mindful of time so that we have time for questions too. So these are some examples around labor trafficking. It's a little bit more specific. Is your job or work different than you were promised? Again, depending on how they answer that and depending on the situation, you may then be able to say, we've got a little bit more going on. But again, nobody is really required to ask all of these questions, but it's a good idea to have something in mind if you're starting to see some red flags. So we can go to the next one. This is around suspected sex trafficking. So what we're going to really go to, though, because I think the question part, that's fine, you can go to the next one, is that it's not necessarily going to be everybody's role to ask that level of detail and question, or as we talked about, if you're not really in a professional role with somebody, it may not make sense to ask those really sort of specific questions because that could potentially feel threatening to the person. So what we really want to talk about is actually what sort of needs do they have and how do we address those? So that's this part of it. Okay. Next one. Because again, I think it's important for the majority of us who will be interacting with potential trafficking survivors, as we said, what we want to be able to create is a feeling around safety. So if someone is being trafficked and they, again, may or may not know it, they may or may not be ready to really seek services. What our job is, again, as a concerned community member or as a professional, is to make it safe for people to seek help, either now or in the future. So part of it is demonstrating your awareness that trafficking is an issue. So again, what you're seeing here are some examples of things that you could ask, but people can pick their own sort of version. But you want to sort of proactively let people know that these subjects are not off limits. You're not afraid to talk about it. And frankly, you're aware of it. So this is just one example. We use it in our program because we do serve survivors of gang control trafficking. But hey, are you worried about girls being used or abused by gangs? Now, you may or may not get a real specific answer, but what you really need to be prepared for is to be tested for your reaction. Anybody who's experienced trafficking has been groomed to think it's their fault, to think it's what they deserve, or to think that that's just how the situation should be. So people will respond thinking that you sort of feel the same way too. So it's also our job then to kind of correct any of those thinking errors. So somebody might say, yeah, somebody deserves to be. If they were stupid enough to hang out with that person, they deserve it. So then it's our job to, again, go back and sort of correct that. So not judgmentally, not buying into some of those thinking errors, but you're creating a safety, an environment where people could share when they're ready. All right, next one. The other part about it, again, this is if you're concerned about trafficking, so you've noticed some of those red flags, you're aware of the possibility, and the goal is really to find out what their needs are and what kind of help we can provide. So normalizing their feelings and the experience, making sure people know their reactions absolutely makes sense. It is terrifying. It is fearful. Pick a phrase that works for you, but also know that people have the right not to accept help at that time. So providing information, and this is some of what we're talking about here, providing information where they can go in the future. The other piece that's really important, if you're sharing information, it's often better to share it verbally. Because again, if someone is being trafficked, they're also being monitored. So somebody coming home with a whole piece of paper, a whole bunch of resources could let a trafficker know that they're in contact with organizations. So can you have in mind the hotline number, other resources, different ways to share it? The other thing that's really important if you're working with trafficking survivors or you're concerned or you sort of suspect that trafficking is going on is that messages of hope are actually what people need. Like part of our job is to really create safety and the opportunity for survivors to feel safe in whatever situation they're in and that they have rights, they're entitled to services, and that they're not alone. All right, next one. So this is about creating safety. I've said it a lot. It's really, really important. These are some best practices if you are speaking with survivors. Using a trauma-informed and non-judgmental approach. If it is within your role to sort of interview, assess, any kind of assessing that you're doing. Also using the same words that survivors use and don't correct them. Allow them to describe their situation with the words that they choose. Be open to very unfamiliar stories. You heard examples Alex shared earlier. What people experience when they've been trafficked are really sometimes hard to understand, but the experience of trafficking can be so disorienting that it's really hard for people to talk logically about what they've experienced. The other piece that's really important is using your authority to create a safe space. What that means is you can fall back on policy and procedure and say, actually, we need to have a private moment because often people who've been trafficked may seek medical care, for example, but their trafficker will be with them. So we want to figure out ways to help people sort of separate safely. So don't rely on a family or friend to do interpreting if you need it. Always use a professional interpreter. If they have a preference for who they would be talking to, male, female, non-binary, just keeping safety in mind for sort of every interaction is actually really important. So again, it might not feel like you're intervening on the trafficking, but if you are helping create a safe space that is respectful to that person, then you really are helping. All right, keep going. And I'm trusting my colleagues to manage the chat because I can't see it, but I see that it's popping up. Establishing trust is another really, really big one. As we said, people who have been trafficked have experienced incredible exploitation and have lost trust. So they trusted somebody and somebody exploited that. So our job is to create and establish trust so that when they are ready, they will come to us with these very particular needs. So it's really important if you're concerned about trafficking, all of the signs are there and they're still not ready to seek help for that. Please try to maintain and continue your services if that's appropriate, or continue your relationship if it's not professional, because eventually they may come and seek support and services. So it is just really important, but also know that until there's trust, they're probably not going to want to share all the information that they need to. So establishing a trusting relationship is really, really important. And in some instances, we might not actually see the outcome of our service. But if they are supported by you, or if they receive information from you, or they're respected by you, that actually really, really goes a very long way in terms of helping them seek assistance in the future. All right, next one, and we're going to get a little bit specific and practical. So part of this is around assessing needs. This is what we really talked about. We may or may not, and I know this is hard for folks, we may or may not be able to establish whether somebody has actually been trafficked. And that is okay because we have experts in our community who can do that. A lot of us in our service provision are in a position, however, to figure out what those needs are stemming from the trafficking. And so can we help address those very specific needs? So when you're talking about listening to what the survivor needs and asks for. So as I said before, it's rare that somebody would ask for services for trafficking, but they might really need housing assistance because they're trying to get away from somebody who is harming them. Or they might be seeking medical care. They will often seek very concrete services, and that's our opportunity to provide a little bit more. Next one. Yeah, so this is sort of a schematic that we have kind of come up with because as you can see, the needs of trafficking survivors are complex. And in some cases, they do require specific expertise to address. In other cases, organizations that provide basic needs, for example, general case management, medical needs, can continue to meet those needs. So can actually sort of do this together. But these are some of the categories of needs that is very likely that a trafficking survivor will have. Safety is a very big one. If it is a current and ongoing trafficking situation, then safety planning is pretty essential. And that is where you want to engage experts, depending on the trafficking situation and the sort of scope and reach of the trafficker. If there is a gang-controlled trafficking, for example, then you want to consult with people who understand how to safety plan in that particular context. If it is labor trafficking with a sort of international conglomerate that has, organized crime connections, there's a different safety planning that's needed from somebody who is navigating an individual trafficker. So know that there are those kind of resources. Immigration statuses, there are human trafficking specific resources as we talked about, but often sort of general case management, because as we said, the basic needs are huge. Legal services, and we're going to talk more about those. Alex and her team do a lot in terms of family law and sort of basic rights. Immigration legal services is another area where someone has an immigration status issue and they are trafficked, referring them to a specialist is essential. And then substance use, as we mentioned, and then sort of trauma recovery. There are specific mental health impacts of being trafficked that often require particular expertise. All right. Next slide, and I think I'm close to.
Yeah, so we're coming up on time. So I just want to
Okay.
let folks know that we are going to be coming up on time pretty soon, which means we're not going to be able to get as in-depth about the resources. But what we are going to do is make sure to share out these slides so everyone has all of those resources. And then we're going to make sure that you have contact information for everyone presenting today so that you can reach out if you need more support and information about those resources. But I do want to make sure that Meredith is able to continue talking through sort of how you have this conversation, and then those resources will be shared out afterwards.
Sounds good. All right. So these are examples that we share, not required to ask all of them, but if you are assessing for safety, these are really good examples of how you might do that. So we again share sort of pick and choose what works with your job or your role and sort of your sort of personal comfort level. Next one. And this sort of rubric or metric for decision making is one that might make sense for everybody on this call to think about, or it might make sense sort of within, if you are a human service professional, within your system and your service area, sort of collectively making some considerations around if you are serving a trafficking survivor or someone that you think is trafficked. What are the expertises that are required that really require a referral out versus what are things that you can continue to provide? So if it is an organization that does trauma recovery services, that might be sufficient and you can consult with experts around some of the trafficking piece. So you can sort of see some of the 4 areas of consideration. Current or past experience is really important in terms of decision making. When trafficking is occurring or you think it is occurring, that is really likely a place where you're going to need a lot of consultation. So consider your partners. You'll see all the resources when we send them out. Expertise required that is specific and outside the scope of your particular role or organization, then collaboration. But often in terms of if you have a rapport with somebody, you have a relationship with somebody, then you can maintain that and sort of be the primary service provider and then consult. and refer. So that's sort of the quick and concise version of that. So go ahead and go, and you'll see on this list. Can you just go to the first page so that everybody sees that? Oh no, sorry, not that one. Next one. These are resources that are helpful for folks, whether you are a professionally intervening or you are a concerned community member. If you really have an inkling and you don't know where to go, these are great places to start to get information and to share. And then you guys can decide how much of the other resources we get to go through.
Yeah, so like I said, we're going to share out these slides with those resources. I'm going to put a link in the chat. We'd really like to hear from you to get an idea of what you learned today. So it would be really helpful if you all could fill that out. And there is a question on there about what questions you still have. So if there's anything that we didn't address today, we can do that. I know that some of our presenters may have to head out, but if not, we can stick around a little bit longer if folks have a couple more questions. And then, like I said, the resource slides, you'll have much more in detail for you to review, as well as all the contact information. If you need to head out, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so glad to have you. And if you have a few minutes to ask some questions, we can also do that. How does that sound? Excellent. All right. So got a lot of love in the chat, a lot of thank yous, great information. Thank you very much. I'm going to post that link to that survey one more time because the chat's going through with all those thank yous. All right. All right. And I see our participant list is going down a bit, so it seems like some folks had to head out. Alex, are you headed out as well? Okay. Well, I'm going to stop our recording now.
No, I look